For decades, residents of Port Richmond have passed a huge black mound at the corner of Castor and Delaware Avenues. It might not look like much, but it's one of the most hazardous sites in the country. It's left over from Philly's past as a manufacturing and industrial hub. There's traces from that time all over the city, whether we're talking about the Northeast and the River Wards or the Navy Yard in the Southwest. Factories and warehouses, both abandoned and in use, dot the city. Some have left behind waste and contamination, like this black mound. Today, I'm talking with reporter Jordan Goss-Perret, who investigated the Franklin slag pile. She's been talking with community members who've pushed the Environmental Protection Agency to share its plans for cleaning up the site. It's Monday, March 30th. I'm Abby Fritz, filling in for Trinae Nari, and we're talking about how industrial waste can get cleaned up in the city. Jordan, what is a Franklin slag pile? I've never heard the term slag pile before. What is this?
Yeah, so in a nutshell, the slag pile consists of copper slag, which is a byproduct of the smelting process. So we have two companies here that are at play that I would say cause the contamination itself. So there was the Franklin Smelting and Refining Corporation, which is now closed. That was on a neighboring piece of property. And when they were operating, they produced this byproduct from their copper smelting process called slag. And then once they produced that, there was a company called MDC Industries that took that byproduct and was actually able to sell that byproduct.
Interesting.
So some of the things that the copper slag could have been used for, sandblasting material, asphalt shingles, which is a widely used roofing cover. So Franklin Smelting and Refining Corporation does not exist. MDC Industries doesn't exist either. Both of the companies that were responsible for this contamination at the slag pile Superfund site, they don't exist anymore. And actually, the company that owns the site itself also is defunct, called Francos Realty Incorporated. So the company, I should say, that owns the site today also, that company is no longer in operation. And so what you see on the site today is the slag that obviously had not been sold.
So it literally is like, it just looks like a big, giant pile of like rubble, kind of. Is that how you describe it?
Yeah. There's I guess like a sort of tarp that is over the slag, this giant pile. I mean, you can go and walk past the chain link fence where this is. And I was really surprised when I visited it for the first time, like how massive this pile actually is and how tall and big. It does look like some sort of like beached whale or some kind of, monstrous growth. But they had this tarp over it to protect the slag from blowing in the wind or moving around, so to contain that slag. But it was interesting. I mean, I just want to make a note that like before any sort of remediation came into play, there were reports when I was going through older documents, EPA documents, that people were like on a windy day, workers from the smelting plant could find this sort of grit in their glasses and their drinks that could have been coming from that slag pile that had been blowing around and spreading.
I'm going to ask you to break this down for me. You've done a ton of reporting on Superfund sites in the area. You have a whole podcast series called Hazardous. So in simple terms, what exactly are Superfund sites?
Yeah, so Superfund sites are considered to be some of the most hazardous to human health and the environment places in the United States. And what is positive about getting a site like that designated a Superfund site is that there is the attention and the resources to the site to try to get this place cleaned up.
So back in 2002, the Franklin slag pile was deemed a Superfund site and placed on this priority list of like the most hazardous places in the country. What made it so dangerous?
Yeah, so, I mentioned that slag is this byproduct of the smelting process. And I mentioned that because that means that this slag in the pile contains this, whole chemical cocktail. There are a lot of ingredients in this slag, but to name like the top hits, which is typical of Superfund sites, actually, high levels of lead, copper, and chromium, and like those would be like the top three. And like lead in particular had been a big concern looking at historical documents. And lead was also in one of these documents. It cites that lead was found in the air, the storm drains, and even the Delaware River that they found that had migrated off.
What can those chemicals and those compounds, like what effect can they have on human health and environmental health?
Yeah. So, I mean, talking about human health, I mean, it could range from like with lead, like neurological issues. And it also depends on, fetus to adults and throughout the lifespan. Mm-hmm. But, high levels of lead, copper, and chromium too, like chromium, it could lead potentially to different types of cancers. But, it would be, and like they mentioned in the documents, that you would have to be ingesting these chemicals in pretty high quantities, though, for it to actually have an effect. But like some of this stuff, though, with animals going into the Delaware River, that has a bigger impact on the different, clams, the fish in that body of water, and severely harming, killing off those animals. And then obviously, too, we know, people do fish from there, and being, eating those fish or eating the animals in the water and ingesting that leads to more exposure to the chemicals. So it's all like cumulative. Another reason why we don't want it to spread is you don't want it in your air, water, and your food. Yeah. That builds up over time. So, but yeah, again, though, like lead has been, it seems like the biggest issue.
Who decides like when these designations are assigned?
Yeah, so the EPA. So there's state Superfund sites and there are federal Superfund sites, and the Franklin Slag is a federal Superfund site. So the EPA has decided that this site deserves the special tender loving care that it needs to get cleaned up. The idea of Superfund was the polluter pays model, that the EPA will say, hey, this site needs to be cleaned up. It's going to cost a lot of money. What we're going to do is find the potentially responsible party or parties that created this waste, and we're going to make them pay to clean it up.
Yeah.
Oftentimes you'd be surprised because historically companies change, companies fold into new companies, they have spinoffs, and it can get a little tricky. Some companies, go bankrupt, and there's these orphan sites, and nobody knows who's responsible and how they can get the money. It gets into like a lot of Superfund sites get into tangled webs of what company's responsible, what city is responsible.
Okay, interesting.
You can do like, a whole chart sometimes. And I've done that sort of thing of like, how are all these companies connected?
So who's going to pay to clean this up then, though?
Yeah, so the state of Pennsylvania is responsible for 10% of the cleanup. And the last time I had checked, that cost was estimated at more than $21 million.
Wow. The
state's responsible for 10% of that cleanup cost. And so who is responsible for the rest of that cost, I am uncertain, because that was the breakdown that I received was this is what the cost is estimated, more than $21 million, and the state's responsible for 10% of that. And why the state is responsible for 10% of that, I am still a little unclear why and where they got 10% from.
Is that usual with Superfund sites, that the state would pay for a certain percentage of it?
I mean, that's is unusual because usually, again, I mean, I guess I want to just keep emphasizing that the whole point of Superfund was the idea that the polluter was supposed to pay to clean up the site, that the taxpayer, the state, the city was not, unless the city, like New York City, we have Superfund site where the city is responsible for the contamination. So yes, you're the polluter, you should pay for that. And in this case, because those companies that I mentioned, they no longer exist, they can't really get any money from a company that no longer exists. But I don't know who's set to cover the rest of that cost. And yeah, why the state in particular is set to pay 10%.
Interesting. I want to kind of zoom back in on Port Richmond and the community that this site is located in. And Port Richmond and the Fishtown area in general used to have a lot of this type of industry, these types of factory and buildings. Tell me, like, in its industrial heyday, what this area would have looked like, what else is around there, what was happening when the Franklin, what was the name of it again? Franklin.
The lovely, very short name, Franklin Smelting and Refining Corporation
Yes.
Corp.
Yes, that one.
Yes. Yes. I mean, really, like, from what I've been told from folks that who had relatives who lived in the area or like longtime Port Richmond residents, is that it didn't really look that different from what it looks like today. If you can just imagine, like, there's still factory buildings and structures and still like factories still running. And the weird thing is like, because of affordable housing problems that are going on in Philadelphia and around other cities, is like, now is the time that people are wanting it to change and, you know, rezone from industrial to residential. But yeah, I imagine the air quality was very different when the smelting factory was going, and the grit in the glasses was going on, and that's not the case anymore. But yeah, people just kept telling me, like, it really does not look that different.
Interesting. I think I was looking on like Google Maps and trying to like look around the area. There's like some sort of like factories and then the giant pile. It's like such a interesting area, and it's interesting to think that it's kind of been a time capsule. And I mean, the slag pile was put on this Superfund site list over 20 years ago. So why hasn't it been cleaned up? That seems like a long time for like a place that's considered so hazardous to sit.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of reasons, and from what my interviews with residents and, you know, the EPA and the state environmental agency, that saying, you know, that because like it is difficult to try to find the person or parties responsible for the cleanup, that takes time. And then say, yeah, like in this case, if you don't, those companies no longer exist, like figuring out where you're going to get the money, that takes time. And because the slag pile is located in an area that is not in very close proximity to humans, that, you know, and that it is gated off, and like the idea is like it needs to be cleaned up. It is hazardous, especially if the material gets out and spreads, but it's not day to day necessarily like impacting people's health and the environment. So like there's no real immediacy. There aren't people actively interacting with the site. Like this is not currently a very walkable area where the site is. So people aren't really seeing it day to day right now. So I think that's one of the reasons why it still has not been cleaned up.
All right, we're going to be getting into the community response to the slag pile after the break. All right, Jordan, can you tell me more about the neighborhood where the slag pile is located, like the people that are living around it? I know we said it's not directly in a neighborhood, but who's out
close
there? Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing, is just like, so the folks that I encountered and like the history of Port Richmond too, that, you know, historically, and you still will find, Polish Americans, people, like I was walking around, I did hear someone with their neighbor, like speaking Polish still. Over the course of my reporting, that I was looking at different community groups in Port Richmond, and I stumbled across this woman named Doris Lynch. She is the president of the Port Richmond Neighborhood Action Group. And I came across her name from their Facebook page, and I reached out to her, and we have talked probably like at least once a week since I began this reporting, or texted each other at least once a week. Doris has lived in Port Richmond for many decades, was there as a child, and left, then came back, left and came back kind of story, like has a real tie to Port Richmond. And you can just tell like she's super passionate about Port Richmond and its residents and really cares about the neighborhood. You know, she had described it too as like, it's still pretty, you know, blue collar in the best way of talking about that. Like people are hard workers. You know, people still work with their hands. And it's, it's very tight knit, she said. And people have had, been there for generations, and people's last names still sort of mean something there. And there's local businesses. Things tend to shut down on Sundays. And I was surprised, though, like when some folks were like, I have never heard of this Superfund site before, or I've never heard of the Superfund program, or, I'm only familiar with the site because I've had relatives that used to work at the smelting plant, but I never really knew what happened after that plant closed.
Yeah.
So
interesting. So is it a danger to the community given that it's not super close, or?
The EPA does say that the contamination from the Franklin slag pile no longer poses a risk to residents. They had, have talked about in the past, like we mentioned, the contamination spreading and going into Delaware River and the storm drains, that it had posed a risk. But the concern really is what is going to happen in the years ahead of us with human-driven climate change. And there is a flood risk in this area, and what is going to happen if the site doesn't get cleaned up. And the area where the site is projected to flood once a year or more by 2050. And if that contamination because of floodwater, and I saw some pretty scary to me, at least, looking projections, of floodwater as time went by, going up, I'm 5'3", going up to my knee and then going up mid-thigh.
Oh, wow.
Of that flowing down. And it doesn't take very long for you to have a flow down and then reach a residential area, and grocery store and bars. And so once this is not contained anymore, that's the issue, is if we don't get this cleaned up and then things do spread and it's not contained, we're going to be at a bigger risk for human health and the environment. Like, they've had flooding in the past. It just has not been flooding to the extent that it's very problematic flooding.
Yeah.
But the expectation or the prediction is that flooding is going to increase in this area, become more frequent as the years go on and as we hit 2050. And I also just wanted to flag too that in thinking about climate change and how that fits into the cleanups of Superfund sites, that it's going to be pretty rare to have a Superfund cleanup plan that integrates climate risks. And so it's not unusual because this cleanup plan does not integrate climate risks for the slag pile. They don't talk about flooding being a risk. There's no mention of climate change and issues, but that's not uncommon for cleanup plans. But I just wanted to throw that out there, that this the cleanup plan for Franklin slag does not take climate change into account.
What have community members been doing to push this cleanup along?
Yeah, trying to get more interaction with the EPA and the state environmental regulatory agencies. So when I started working on this, Doris, who was part of a community group, had said, it had been more than a year since they had had any notice from the EPA or any status update about this site, and that, it hasn't been regular contact, hasn't been regular updates for the community about what's going on with the site. And so when we first talked, she was like, I didn't even know that they were wanting to start cleanup because they didn't reach out. We had no idea. Shouldn't the community have a say in the cleanup process? And, and so she then ended up reaching out to officials asking for a community meeting. And they did have a community meeting after more than a year. They had that earlier this month, where the community then was able to outline, hey, this is what we're doing for the cleanup. This is the plan, But I thought that was interesting. Just they didn't really have much communication from the EPA. And, I get it too. Like, people are busy as well, like the residents and everything. And but it shouldn't necessarily be up to the residents to have to keep pushing to find out what's going on with sites like these.
Did they learn any new information from this meeting that they pushed for?
The only piece of new information that I'm aware of, a resident that attended the meeting, they had said, and I didn't know this, that the Delaware River Trail that is going to go through this neighborhood, so it's walkable, that it will. And this is a quote that from this community member from the meetings, that the cleanup of the Superfund site is going to impact the Delaware River Trail project that they're doing through the site. And she said, once the EPA realized this during the meeting, thanks to residents, the residents brought this up, like, how is this gonna impact? The EPA representatives discussed rerouting the Delaware River Trail during the remediation work. So,
oh, interesting.
That was something new to me.
When is this expected to happen, and how long is it projected to take?
At the community meeting, I was told that they had talked about spring starting. And during my reporting, over the months that I reported this, it was always summer. It was either early summer or just summer. And then I do have in my article, because it was, there were a couple of folks that were like, we don't know how long this is going to take to clean up. We don't know how long. I did find a document that did state that is scheduled to be completed by November 2029. Okay. But a lot of people I talked to, it was more vague of we don't really know when. We'll know more once we get started.
You know, there's a lot going on in the federal government right now. The Trump administration has made changes to the EPA, particularly around regulation. Could any of that affect these cleanup efforts?
Potentially. Because of the staffing issues and the funding specifically to EPA. However, I mean, Trump, even in his first administration, seemed to really rally around the cleanup of these sites, and still seems to, like Lee Zeldin, beating the drum that these sites need to get cleaned up quicker. My concern with that is that getting them cleaned up quicker, yes, but also ensuring that it's done correctly. Because, I mean, from my perspective, like, rallying around Superfund is also good for an administration because it's something easy to check off a box and to physically show, hey, we did something. We cleaned up this hazardous site in your neighborhood. You can thank us later. It's an easier thing to do, tangible thing to do. So it's just, when we talk about it getting cleaned up quickly, just wanting to make sure. There have been sites that have been Superfund, gotten off the list because the government says it's clean. Years down the road, got back on the list because guess what? It actually was not clean.
And I mean, since the state has to front some of this bill as well, you know, last year in Pennsylvania, the state budget was held up for months. Funding can be hard to come by. You know, is this something that the state, you know, having to fork out for it could impact?
Potentially. I mean, so the person that I had who had given me that 10% number that I had talked with on background was like pretty clear, like, this is gonna, like, we have the funding to do this. Like, this is not going to be a hard thing for us to do. But, you know, again, I don't know. Nothing is ever really certain. And until the money is actually handed over, and to my knowledge, none of this money, the more than 21 million, has been. I could be wrong, but from my last reporting, none of that money has been put into anything.
Are there any other of these hazardous sites, these Superfund sites in Philly right now?
Yeah, so right now there is just one other site that is currently Superfund. There were a few more and they've gotten delisted. So, and some have gotten, you know, they're now being reused. So there is a site called the Metal Bank. But the thing I just want to make, like, I guess, shine a light on is that Philly does, as we know, border, you know, New Jersey, other states like Camden, the city of Camden. Camden itself has 8 Superfund sites with one that's proposed. So they might have 9. You think about the other communities that border Philadelphia, that even though it's not directly in Philly, that those sites still, I think, have an impact on, you know, you're still connected to those places.
Where is the other Superfund site in Philly? I haven't heard of it.
Yeah, so Metal Bank, it's along the Delaware River.
Okay, so that's up in the northeast?
Yes.
It looks like, yeah.
Yeah, and of course, yeah, it looks like contaminated water and species in the water, clams, birds, and fish, and the endangered Atlantic and short-nosed sturgeons.
For people that are concerned about living around sites like these, what can they do?
Yeah, I mean, if you're concerned and want to learn more about a Superfund site near you, that EPA still does have profiles of sites, and they do have a database where you can type in your state and then type in your city and see what Superfund sites are near you, and then you can click on each of those Superfund site profiles and learn a lot more about the history and what's being done to clean those sites up. And I think that's a good thing, learning more about it. And then, obviously too, like, I've seen it work, and like Port Richmond's a good example, is when are upset about this, that it's worked in Port Richmond, contacting your politician, your local politicians. And if it is actually a Superfund site, has been declared, Superfund has a program called the Community Advisory Group. Communities can actually get some funding, a little bit of funding from the EPA to form these community groups that really acts as a checks and balance between the community and the EPA. And, more people, the better that you have as a front to work toward cleaning these sites up.
All right, Jordan Gaspare, thank you so much for being here with me today on CityCast Philly.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
You can read more of Jordan's full story at the link in our show notes, and we'll have a link to her other work. That's all for today here on CityCast Philly. If you're just learning about the Franklin slag pile like me, send this to a friend. Rate the show, leave us a review, and subscribe. Be sure to sign up for our morning newsletter to learn more about what else Philly's talking about. And don't forget, you can support the show and get great perks by becoming a CityCast Philly neighbor at membership.citycast.fm. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Bye. Excited to talk about this with you, Jordan.
Putting the fun in super fun. That's what we say in the biz.